Good evening. Okay. My name is Dan Finn. Ooh, that's good, isn't it? My name is Dan Finn, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. But before I do, let me just explain the process. Our speaker will speak for about 40 minutes. We'll then have questions and answers. If it goes with enough energy, enough questions, we may go till 9:30, but no later. And then afterwards, there'll be some cookies and refreshment out in the lobby. You'll get a chance to talk to him or other friends of yours. I have a message for the first-year students in the room, and that is that often, as good as the lecture is, the questions afterwards and the answers are really good. So if you're tempted to leave, we encourage you to stay. And of course, the juniors and seniors already know about that, and they'll all stay anyway. So our speaker tonight is professor of economics at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire. He is a distinguished economist. He's taught at other places temporarily, visiting professor at Chicago, at MIT. He's been teaching at Yale. He has had a lot of experience in international trade. He's been a fellow at the Peterson Institute. He's been involved at the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, the President's Council of Economic Advisors, and the International Monetary Fund, where he's been a visiting scholar. He's given a host of interesting lectures all over the world, so we're really happy to have him here with us tonight. He's been the editor on the editorial board of several professional journals. His recent 2017 book, Clashing Over Commerce, has won lots of awards, translated into Chinese and Japanese. 7 other books. He's a scholar's scholar. 6 edited books, one on Jagdish Bhagwati, who gave the Clemens lecture in this room 19 years ago. And he's done dozens of articles and a number of newspaper involvements for him. Some of them are interesting. Back in the 90s, he wrote an essay called NAFTA, Nifty, Noxious, or Both. And another one for the New York Times entitled, If We Buy American, No One Else Will. So he's got a lot that he's been up to. And just in case you think that he's a little bit too serious and part of the dismal science, as some people call us, you'll be glad to know that on a podcast for National Public Radio, he compared Reed Smoot and Willis Hawley, the authors of the famous Smoot-Hawley tariffs back in 1930, he compared them to 2 Muppets, Statler and Waldorf. I don't know if you know Statler and Waldorf, but he thinks they're similar to Smoot and Hawley. And he also has claimed in print that Taylor Swift has a few things to teach us. In her songs, The Story of Us and Better Than Revenge, we can learn something about both teaching economics and what it's like to experience college classes under COVID online. So he has quite a range of possibilities. His title, as you can see here, is The Past and Future of Globalization. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Douglas Irwin.
Thank you very much for attending, and it's a great pleasure to be here, indeed an honor. I've been told that I can take off my mask as long as I don't cross this line here. So I'll keep my distance, but it's much more comfortable to speak without the mask. And once again, thank you very much for coming. I want to thank Dan Finn for the great honor of asking me to give this lecture, and Lewis Johnson, who is a great economic historian and champion of the state of Minnesota for all the things he's done over the years for the economic history community, and indeed helping out on my research every now and then with the various data he has collected. So what I'd like to talk about tonight is the past and future of globalization. Tell us a little bit about where we've been in the world and possibly where we're going, even though forecasting is a difficult exercise. But there's some trends that have occurred in the world economy over your lifetime and will continue for the next few decades that I think are interesting in terms of America's position in the world and what we're going to be confronting as a nation around the globe. So the first thing I should do is just define what is globalization. What does the terminology mean, and what should we take away from this? From an economist standpoint, it's just the increased economic interaction among countries around the world. And there are various facets to this dimension of economic integration. It's trade in goods, it's trade in services, it's capital flows between countries, movement of labor across countries, either temporarily or permanently, and the movement of technology and data across countries as well. I'm going to focus mainly on the trade in goods and international trade per se, but a lot of these things will sort of follow one from the other. The first thing to note about globalization is it's not a new phenomenon, that people have been interacting with one another, trading with one another since time immemorial. So one can go back and look at even trade between the Roman Empire and China. In various times, this is like 100 AD or so, and you can see all across, there's no sea routes at this time, but there's a lot of overland routes and some sea routes in the Indian Ocean connecting these two geographic regions, Western Europe and East Asia, in a very slow, very costly process of exchanging goods. Now, of course, these expanded with time, and these are the trade routes in the 11th and 12th century. You can see they've expanded a little bit, but they largely replicate those earlier trade routes, a little bit more into North Africa and into the Arabian Peninsula. But once again, these trade routes have been around the globe for many, many decades. Then we can go to the 19th century, and now we can see we've added in more sea routes around Africa, across the Pacific, certainly across the Atlantic, now involving North and South America, and sort of gradually stepping towards ever-increasing integration in terms of the movement of people, technology, trade in goods, and things of that sort. Well, that's sort of the history, but I want to talk about more recent phenomena. But before I even do that, I can't just resist talking about what I call the 5 modern epochs of globalization. The modern period of globalization really starts here in the 19th century with the steamship, with the integration of the North Atlantic economies and into East Asia as well. And what this led to is rising trade shares in various countries. In other words, the way we measure this as economists is the trade to GDP ratio. Take a country's exports and imports and divide it by total GDP, the total size of the economy, and if that's been going up, then that's sort of one measure of global economic integration. So here's a chart that's going to plot trade as a share of GDP starting in the mid-19th century up to the present. And broadly speaking, there's some fluctuations, but broadly speaking, there are 5 eras of globalization. I'll focus mainly on the last 2, but I'll just show this to you first of all, and we can take a look. So the title says Globalization Over 5 Centuries, because if you find this on the Our World in Data website, they'll go back to those earlier periods, but I truncated it just to focus on the late 19th century up to 1915 or so. And what you can see here is there's 2 ways of measuring this just based on the data, but gradually sort of slowly rising levels of integration in the late 19th century up to World War I. Now, 2 things were driving this. And there are basically 2 drivers of globalization that are sort of, you can see through time. One is technology and the cost of doing business across countries, whether it's the physical cost of moving goods or what have you. Those were declining during this period because we had the steamship being introduced. The other element to globalization is policy. How receptive are countries to trade with others? Do they erect high barriers to trade, or do they reduce those barriers? Those barriers were fairly stable, but slowly rising in the late 19th century, which may have tempered this rise in the period 1. Now, in period 2, you can see there's a dramatic decline in the trade shares. In other words, a disintegration of the world economy. This is the interwar period, roughly from World War I up until the end of World War II, when obviously wars were very disruptive to global commerce. The 1920s was maybe a roaring decade for the U.S., but it was not for the rest of the world. The 1930s was the period of the Great Depression. And even though we had the telegraph and radio and other things that were keeping markets close together, policy, in terms of the Smoot-Hawley tariff that you referred to, in fact, if there's any economic podcast that I've been involved with, it's the one with Planet Money on Smoot-Hawley. because it brings in Ferris Bueller's Day Off and the Muppets and all sorts of other things. But that's the second period here, when policy is raising barriers and limiting national integration. That brings us to the post-World War II period, which is period 3 here, 1945 up until 1980 or so. When you see these, the level going back up and beginning to rise, that is because, once again, technology and policy. The United States led the world in terms of trying to reduce trade barriers and promote global commerce as a way of recovering from the Great Depression. Those were somewhat successful efforts for a part of the world, not the whole world, and that accounts for this period number 3. But the two periods I really want to focus on are periods 4 and 5. Period 4, some have called it a hyper-globalization era. You can see that the trade ratios really begin to rise between about 1985 up until about 2008. Dramatic increase in globalization during this period. Now, the students may not have fully lived through that whole period, but I certainly remember it, and it was a remarkable era in terms of what happened in the world, and I think economic historians in the future will look back on that 20-year period or so, say from 1985 to 2008 or so, as a remarkable period in global history. And so I want to talk about that. But now we're in a different era, era 5, where you can see that these indicators have sort of peaked and maybe even falling off. That's where we are today, and that's where I want to, what I want to talk about as well. But let's talk about this period 4. Which certainly from your professor's standpoint is, once again, I think a dramatic change in the world economy. So what were the forces driving global economic integration from the 1980s up until 2008 financial crisis? Once again, I highlighted two things before: transportation costs, or the costs of transacting across markets, trade costs, if you will, and whether trade barriers are going up or down. Sometimes these two things are pushing in the same direction. Sometimes one is offsetting the other. In the 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s, both technology and policy were driving global economic integration in the same way, in the same direction, towards more integration, and that has led to the globalized world that we're in today. So, declining transport costs, first of all, the introduction of air freight, which had not previously been a major component of world trade, and containerization even before that. And then I'll talk about the declining trade barriers. So what are these transport costs? Well, air transport. Now, how did the airlines manage to get through the pandemic, particularly the international airlines, when there was virtually no international tourism or people weren't allowed to move between countries? There are literally pictures of 747s with crates and goods in the seats. They didn't bother to take out the seats. They just converted those passenger jets to carry freight and cargo. And so here's a 747 from KLM, just loading up the cargo from the front nose, and some passengers maybe on some of the seats, but cargo being very important. It's not just these boxes that can get transported. Cows. We export cattle to China on 747s. It's faster, apparently cheaper, than doing it by ship, and so they're flying on 747s as well. Perhaps the best example of how air freight has changed is this aircraft called the Airbus Beluga. The Airbus has a fleet of about 5 of these really odd aircraft, and no, this is not fake news on the internet. There actually is the Airbus Beluga, and this is the way it looks like. That's the first one. Why did Airbus introduce this? They introduced it for their own production, not so much to carry the commerce of other companies. So the way Airbus makes its aircraft in Western Europe is they source parts from all over Western Europe and indeed the world. So some parts will come from Spain, some from Germany, some from Britain. We'll see how long that lasts with Brexit. Other parts of Europe, and here's what they do. So in the top panel here, there's a picture of a fuselage being stuffed into the nose of this Airbus Beluga. That's a big chunk of one of the Airbus jets. And in the bottom one, there's a Singapore Airlines tail fin for maybe the A380 or some other aircraft being once again put in. And then it's going to be shipped to Toulouse. Toulouse is where the final assembly takes place, but you can see that various components, wings, flaps, parts of the fuselage can be made all over Europe and then brought to Toulouse. It can't be shipped by sea because Toulouse is inland. It can't be shipped by rail because the tail fin is so large it would knock out every bridge between where it's being made and Toulouse. So they have to air freight it in, and they needed a special aircraft to do that. So that's pretty remarkable that the A380 can be assembled with parts made all over Western Europe and elsewhere in the world. And that is made possible by, that fragmentation of production is made possible by air freight. It's not just air freight, of course, it's sea freight as well. So if one looks at ocean shipping costs, there's not necessarily the dramatic declines that are commonly thought to have taken place in the late 19th century with the introduction of the steamship and what have you. But over the 1980s and 90s, there was a gradual reduction in ocean shipping rates, and partly that reflects containerization. So what is containerization? Well, I'm sure you've seen these absolutely enormous ships with all these containers on top of them, stuffed with all sorts of goods made in China or Korea or Western Europe and being brought to the U.S., and of course, containers going out as well, since trade is a two-way street. We import goods from the rest of the world, we export goods to the rest of the world. This has dramatically lowered the cost of shipping goods across markets. This has dramatically increased the productivity of port workers, as I'll show you, because it's not men doing hard labor, bringing the grain out of the bellies of the ships in nets or what have you. It's literally things are in containers and they can be automatically taken off with very capital-intensive production methods like this. And it's led to this dramatic surge, it contributed to this dramatic surge in world trade. Just one indication of the productivity gains, and therefore the cost reductions and the efficiencies introduced with containerization. Here's a study on the impact of containerization in Europe. And look at the pre-container era from 1965. There's productivity and average ship size. So the productivity is 1.7 tons per hour. That's how much you can offload or onload in the pre-container era. After containerization, it goes from 1.7 to 30 tons per hour by lifting the cartons, the containers off of these large ships. And what's happened to these ship sizes? More than doubled from 8.4 to 9.7 GRTs, gross registered tonnage. So you get these absolutely enormous ships, as I sort of showed you right here, that can carry, hundreds of containers. And what this has contributed to is a growth in the real volume of world trade. Here's just showing you the pre-containerization era. It actually goes back to the late 1960s, but it really didn't pick up until the 1980s or so in terms of its impact on world commerce. And if you're at all interested in containerization, as we were talking about at dinner, there's a wonderful book by Mark Levinson called The Box, which is just all about the people who brought the container to reality. Now, containers, of course, are a little bit risky because if one container actually happens to get dislodged from the ship, it can fall into the ocean and you lose your cargo. And that happened with rubber duckies. A ship leaving Hong Kong in 1992 hit an enormous storm. A couple of the containers spilled off, and some of them were filled with little plastic rubber ducks. This actually could have been an environmental disaster. I think there were 30,000 rubber duckies that fell into the ocean, but it actually turned out to be a boon for oceanographers because they could track the currents in the Pacific. And they found some of these rubber duckies more than 2 decades later in Western Europe, showing up on the shores of France, and some came down to South America. And of course, the west coast of the U.S. also received its share. People would find rubber duckies on the beach. And if you're at all interested in this, there's a book written about Moby Duck and what happened with this, the disaster that afflicted over 28,000 bath toys and how people tried to deal with it later. There's a more recent example of some of the problems that can accrue when you put a lot of cargo on one ship. And it's an awfully big ship. As you might have recalled earlier this spring, there was a ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal. And once again, it's one of these large container ships. There's a stiff breeze. There's actually a current in the Suez Canal as well, and it became very hard to manage. Now, people sort of made fun of the ocean liner that got stuck this way, but if you go on some websites, they actually had a game about how you can pilot one of these large ships through a narrow canal, and actually it's a lot harder than you think. because of wind and factors like that. So here's just where the Suez Canal is in Egypt, and it's a very thin canal, and so if you get one of these ships wedged in the wrong way, it took more than a week to try to dig it out. And of course, ships so big, cranes so small, it took a little while for them to dislodge it because it had run aground, and they're constantly having to dredge the Suez Canal. Here's just another picture. It led to a bottleneck. So I know you sometimes complain about the construction going to Minneapolis and the backlog of traffic. Well, this is a major backlog because the Suez Canal is a major region for world trade. And so in the Red Sea and in the lake up above where the ship got stuck, there were a lot of backed up cargo. So it turns out that 13% of world trade goes through the Suez Canal. And if you want to think about alternate routes, well, that means going around Africa. That adds a lot of time and a lot of fuel. And so a lot of ships just decide to wait and see when it would get blocked. But the impact, the economic impact was pretty big. It was halting $9.6 billion of trade a day. So containerization, yes, when it works well, it's really encouraged global commerce. But if there's a little bit of a disruption, it can be quite costly. So because of technology that came into use in the 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s, containerization, air freight, we are now much more integrated. But that has been supplemented by an equally powerful force, changes in trade policy. More and more countries, particularly in the 1980s and 1990s, decided unilaterally to bring down their own barriers to trade. Now, even though U.S. trade policy, in terms of our barriers, haven't changed all that much over the past couple of decades, when other countries decide to open up, because trade is this two-way street, there will be an increase in global commerce, and that will have an impact here in the United States. When China was isolated and closed, there was no fear of Chinese goods in the U.S. market. But because China decided to open up, they are importing a lot, but they're also become an export superpower and affecting our own economy. And the same is not just with China, but many other countries over time have done this. So when we look at what I'll call trade liberalization episodes, when countries decide to unilaterally open up their economies to foreign commerce in a big way. Now, once again, most countries are always engaged in commerce to some extent, but usually these trade barriers had been very high in the developing world. What we can see is there were a few early countries that decided to open up, but that's in the single digits. Between 1985 and 1995, there was a rash of countries that moved towards more open markets. Each did so for its own individual reasons, but there are some common threads. First of all, in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, which had been a completely isolated part of the world because of communism, they decided to open up and move towards not just democracy, but more freer markets, including international trade. They wanted to integrate with Western Europe. Many developing countries had become frustrated with development programs that had not led to much economic progress. There's something called import substitution, which is the idea that developing countries should not import manufactured goods, but try to produce them themselves. They tried that for several decades, but it led to sometimes a lot of manufacturing in their countries, but at a very inefficient level that was not internationally competitive and that was holding back economic progress. And they decided to try a new tact, which is to focus on exports and the advantages of international commerce. So many countries, as this indicates, not just China, but many other countries from Vietnam to countries in Latin America to other countries in South Asia decide to move in this direction. And to bring that off, you needed a team of economists to be advising policymakers saying, you know what, I think we ought to try a different tact when it comes to international trade. So in India, there was a reform team that took over in 1991, consisting of the Prime Minister, the Finance Minister, Manmohan Singh, who was an Oxford DPhil, who had written his thesis in the early 1960s on India's exports and why they were underrated by the Indian government. Chidambaram was the Minister for State for Commerce, also wanted to liberalize trade policy, and they were advised by Montek Singh Ahluwalia, who was the Finance Secretary, and these were the core individuals who advised the prime minister to change policy. I was very fortunate to meet Mantak Singh Ahluwalia in India, and he has written a memoir recently where he details how difficult it was to bring off economic reform, because there are a lot of entrenched interests that do not want change. Paul Romer, a recent Nobel laureate in economics, once said that everyone wants progress, but no one wants change, because change is disruptive, some groups will lose, and this whole process of reform is very difficult, sometimes very painful. But what India did was bring down its tariff rates, its taxes on imports, from a maximum, actually it's off this chart, the maximum in 1990 was 350%, down to 150 in 1991, and then bringing down the maximum rate to about 10% by the early 2000s. And it's not just these taxes on trade that India had, they had a lot of quantitative restrictions, where you needed you needed government permission to import goods. And the import permission was very difficult to obtain for various reasons. So India became a big part of global commerce. And once again, we can judge that by that metric that I used before, which is the trade share. How much are exports and imports a part of your economy? And for decade after independence, the trade share was about 10%. That's a combination of exports and imports. That's very low considering where other developing countries that are more engaged in trade, what those numbers were. And you can see after 1991 or so, that begins to rise up until the mid-aughts, I guess, 2008 or so. And notice what the title here says: India's economy opened dramatically until recently. So that's going to bring us to, let's just keep that in mind, because that's our fifth era of globalization. But what was going on in India was going on in many, many other countries. So if you looked at, once again, these taxes, tariffs, taxes on imports in Western Europe, the United States, and North America, and advanced countries of the OECD, those tariffs were pretty low. Yes, they came down a bit more during this period, but it's really in the developing world, in Latin America, South Asia, East Asia, and elsewhere, those tariffs really came down and led to this explosion in commerce. Another example is Korea, which did this a little bit earlier on. Korea had relatively high tariffs, but was really stifling their international trade was their exchange rate, which was hopelessly overpriced and therefore priced out of the world market Korean goods until recently. Not so recently, actually the 1960s or so, but here's the black market premium on the Korean won. In the 1950s, that was over 100 to 150% or so, which was artificially raising the cost of Korean goods on the world market. It's no wonder that Korea's exports were negligible during that period. They did a couple of devaluations, brought it down, but in the late 1960s, they basically gotten rid of that overvaluation of their currency, which meant that their currency was more competitively priced, which led to a growth of commerce in Korea, and that unleashed the Korean miracle. So if you look at Korea around 1960, this is Seoul. In 1960, what does this look like today? That was the power of what happened when you engaged in the world, got access to better technology, able to sell some of your exports, and able to import better technology, better capital goods to enable you to produce, first of all, textiles, second of all, shoes, third, iron and steel products, and finally, semiconductors and laptops from Samsung. Does anyone know what city this is? That's the way it is now. Here's the way it was originally. This is Shanghai. And if you notice this clock tower right here, that stays the same. They don't change that. But the whole skyline has absolutely changed between, say, 1980 and a more recent period. That's the power of bringing more open markets. Once again, China was not engaged in international trade to any significant extent in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and it was Deng Xiaoping in the late 1970s that began the process of opening up that was accelerated in the 1990s. Here's China's foreign trade zone, which they created in 1981 as an outlet for global commerce. That's it in 1981. Here it is in 2013. Once again, an utter transformation. And what did this do? Both in India and in China and in Chile and in Korea and in Taiwan and in other countries that embarked on this path is it led to an explosion of economic growth that began to increase their GDP per capita, their national income, relative to the rest of the world. So this is going way back for economic historians to 1800. Between 1800 and 1950, this is India, Indonesia, China, as a share of per capita income in the UK, just showing they're going from about 35 to 45% down to about 5% of the per capita income. This begins to turn around between 1950 and 2000, and they begin to rise, achieve higher incomes as a result of the process of opening up to trade. What about inequality? Well, there's a recent study in the Economic Journal on global earnings inequality between 1970 and 2018, and this covers this period in the 1980s and 90s when so many countries were reversing their policies regarding global engagement. And lo and behold, earnings inequality begins to fall because developing countries are beginning to catch up to the rest of the world in income. Very low level, but they're moving up the ladder. And what this has done, rising incomes, has led to a reduction in the share of populations living under extreme poverty. So the red line there, which you can't quite see so well, it's right here. This is East Asia and the Pacific. Notice it starts out at 60%, one of the highest in the world, and by 2013 it's way down here, one of the lowest. That's largely driven by China, but it's not just China. It's Vietnam, it's Korea, and a bunch of these other countries as well. You see slower declines elsewhere. There's South Asia right above the world there. The one region, which I'll come back to later on, that has been the least globalized and therefore has made the least dent in poverty is sub-Saharan Africa. So we'll come back to that. Here's another way of looking at it, which may be a little bit more clear in terms of looking at the total population, just counting numbers. How many hundreds of millions or billions of people living in extreme poverty? And where has the biggest dent been? It's that red area, East Asia and the Pacific. Once again, starting in 1990 or so, with hundreds of millions of people in China being led out of extreme poverty and destitution to either lower middle class income or something better. Some progress also in South Asia, but of course the blue there is the sub-Saharan Africa where there's been not much of a dent. If that's not dramatic enough, here's another graphic that can sort of show this. Here's the state of world poverty in 1993. Okay, right as this process was beginning to unfold with more openness in many countries. You can see China's there, the biggest, India's big, yellow countries are Africa, Indonesia's pretty big as well, and then other countries in the world. That's 1993. Here it is 20 years later in 2013, and how much it's shrunk. Once again, China's huge, India shrank a little bit, but Africa has remained stubbornly high. So just here's the before, there's the after. And you can see where there has been progress. Look at Vietnam down there. Vietnam almost disappeared. So that's pretty amazing. And then here it is just in terms of numbers. Once again, world population since 1950 has soared. Originally, the number of people living in extreme poverty was also going up with the number of people in the world. But once again, that has begun to come down as a result of some of these developments. Just to show you the dramatic, this is why, once again, economic historians looking back the last 20, 30, 40 years or so will say this is a fundamental change in the entire global economy. Look at worldwide income distribution. In 1800, and once again, these are various regions, that's the top distribution of global income. And obviously, it's below the poverty line that we would draw today. Most people are to the left of the line, which is a very thin line right here. And it was really just Britain and a few other countries on sort of the right-hand tail that have this lower but higher level of income. By 1975, we have a bimodal distribution. So we have Western Europe and North America that has moved ahead, but the rest of the world did not. They were stuck behind and a much lower level of income. And there's a term that was used at the time, the third world, which is no longer used because there were three worlds at that time. There was Western Europe, the capitalist countries, if you will, North America. There was the second world, which is the communist world, which once again was completely isolated unto themselves, China, the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe. And then there's a third world, non-aligned countries in Africa, South Asia, Latin America, which also were largely insulated from global commerce. But with the erasing of those barriers, because the trade barriers had come down, we now are back to a uniform or more uniform distribution of world income. Once again, Africa is where there's the most poverty, but those countries have moved up the income scale as a result. And this is why The Economist a couple of years ago had this prospect that we were moving towards the end of poverty. If China and other countries continued with 7, 8, 9, 10% rates of economic growth, that would begin to alleviate poverty around the world. And according to The Economist, they would say it's not because the United Nations declared some anti-poverty goal. It wasn't because of foreign aid, which was not increasing a lot during this period. It was economic growth. And they would attribute it to freer trade that has eased that destitution. That has led many activists who have been made their lifelong concern, or part of their life concern, to be with global poverty, to acknowledge this. And Bono of U2's fame, who after doing all the hits and all the concerts decided he wanted to focus his life on easing global destitution and poverty, said recently at a talk at Georgetown, foreign aid is just a stopgap. Capitalism can take more people out of poverty than foreign aid. And if you look at this video, which is on YouTube, there's a very funny moment when he sort of puts his head down on the podium and says, "Rockstar preaches capitalism. Sometimes I hear myself and I just can't believe it." But he goes on to talk about the power of entrepreneurship in terms of raising incomes, increasing commerce, and the necessity of bringing that to Africa. Now, in many of these countries, there's been a great suspicion of foreign commerce. They don't want to be exploited. They don't want foreign multinationals to come in. Those concerns are still with us, but they've been diminished somewhat. Because even more radical economists, such as Joan Robinson, who was taught at Cambridge University for many years, used to say now, the misery of being exploited by capitalism is nothing compared to the misery of not being exploited at all. So in other words, if you bring in foreign commerce, yes, there are some risks associated with that, but there are also enormous benefits. So that is a period in global world economic history which I think is absolutely remarkable for changing the world. But that's not quite the world we've been in for the last 15 years or so, since 2008. And that brings me to this last point about period number 5. If you look at a number of these indicators are now just peaking or going down. So that raises the question, is globalization a spent force? Are we going to be living now in a deglobalizing world? What are the prospects for the future? And in fact, there are a number of signs along this line. So since 2008, first of all, the two drivers of globalization have stalled out. That is, transportation innovations seem to be slowing. Once we have these huge ships with containers, we can't do much more to make those more efficient. And trade reforms. Once India has cut its tariffs down from 300% down to 5%, well, going from 5 to 0, if they were ever to do that, the marginal gain in terms of reducing trade costs is just not there. In addition, some countries are now backing off those trade reforms and going from tariffs of, say, 5% up to 10%, as India is considered in some products. So trade reforms have stalled. And what we've seen since 2008 is a peak in global value chains, by which economists mean the fragmentation of production and the specialization of countries in different components that leads to an increase in trade. We've seen China and India begin to turn inward, let alone the United States, a trade war between the US and China. And then the question is the pandemic. What does the post-pandemic world look like in terms of increasing globalization? So The Economist dubs this slowbalization. Okay, we're just sort of ratcheting it down in terms of how much increased integration we're going to have, and just some indicators of this. So here's the world trade volume divided by industrial production. And once again, 1990s, 2000s, up to 2008, when you can see the financial crisis there, it's been flat since. So not so much of a tendency to increase trade as a share of industrial production. How about global value chains, which is just trade within companies, sometimes of components, such as your iPhones, if you have that, that's truly a world product where the camera could come from Germany, the casing could come from Vietnam, the semiconductors could come from Korea, Other parts can come from the U.S., but it's all assembled in China. That's the iPhone. But we're seeing more companies not doing that, not subdividing tasks between countries, and global value chains, according to the World Bank, sort of peaked in 2008 and have been sort of easing downward since then. And that's where you see India as well, after 2008 or so, a lot of these indicators coming down. The big change, of course, is, or one of the big changes, many big changes, is China, where under President Xi, they've moved in a very different direction than they had moved under previous premiers, which had followed in the footpaths of Deng Xiaoping in opening up their economy to the globe. President Xi, if you follow the Wall Street Journal or some other Financial Times, every day you'll read a story about how there's a crackdown on this firm, how politics is intruding in the economy there. And there's a book by Nick Lardy of the Peterson Institute called The State Strikes Back, The End of Economic Reform in China. And so things are really moving in a quite different direction. So here's just a New York Times article. Post-virus economic strategy for China looks inward. Okay, not continuing to engage with the globe, but moving inward, becoming a little bit more self-sufficient. Here's the Wall Street Journal. China backslides on economic reform. Here's the Financial Times. China's escalating its punishment diplomacy. So if you are Australia, or you are New Zealand, or you are Korea, and you say something nice about Taiwan, or you say something not so nice about the pandemic and where it came from, they will hit you with tariffs. We just saw a trade of CEOs and executives of Canadian firms and Huawei. China's playing a tit-for-tat game of saying, if we don't like some aspect of your foreign policy, some aspect of your domestic policy that inflicts on what we think are our interests, we will hit you with commercial sanctions. And so, remarkably, while we still think of China as being this major exporter, here's just China's exports as a share of its GDP. Once again, big growth particularly in the 2000s, but since 2008, it fell with the crisis, and it's been going downward since. So China's moving inwards. If you have either the world's first or second largest economy beginning to focus inward, obviously that's going to have a big ramifications for the global economy overall. And that, of course, is setting even aside whether China is going to, how they're going to influence world trade developments in the WTO and in future relationships with the United States. So the Economist also asked, does China play fair? There's a lot of concern about unfair trade practices. That was underlined by President Trump, who imposed tariffs on imports from China, which led to retaliation against U.S. exports. So bilateral trade has been hit as a result of that. It's not just China, it's many other countries too, beginning to look inward. And so the Economist is saying, is the world economy closing down? Is foreign policy says, is this the end of globalization? There's the coronavirus hitting the globe. Even the Economist says, goodbye globalization, the dangerous allure of self-sufficiency. Because the pandemic has been such a frightening event, countries turn inward because they are worried about their security. Where do we get our masks? Where do we get our vaccines? Where do we get our personal protective equipment? We have to look inward. We want those things sourced domestically. We don't want to rely on international trade. What happens if that container ship carrying masks from China doesn't make it here? What if China withholds those? Maybe we should make things here. It's not just the U.S. thinking that, it's many countries around the globe wanting to be more self-sufficient in certain commodities. Now, the Economist says the dangerous lure of self-sufficiency. It's not as though global commerce is completely gone. In fact, it's come right back very quickly as a result of with the pandemic, as compared with the 2008 financial crisis, which is the lighter line there, and it shows how deep and long that was. The pandemic immediately had a crushing impact on world trade, but it's come right back. If you're following, once again, the news, there's a lot of congestion at U.S. ports, precisely because trade has come back and they're not yet at full capacity. And so some goods may not make it in for Halloween or Christmas or what have you, but trade has come back, but to a level that may not be equal to the way it was exactly before. And so that's why Gillian Tett, writing in the Financial Times, says, reports of globalization's death are greatly exaggerated. Trade has come back. Globalization isn't dying, it's just evolving to a new set of patterns. But I think there's no doubt that the level of integration is not what we're going to see, not what we saw in the pre-2008 decade or so. So I would say there's a slight deglobalization going on. It's not a reversal completely. It's not a complete end to the process. But those first three things there that were the true drivers during the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, containerization, air freight, economic reform, those things have been done. They're not going to continue to push trade to higher levels. And now we see these other offsetting effects of global multinationals sort of pulling back from global sourcing. A retreat on economic reform, where countries are raising trade barriers, not reducing them so much. There's the pandemic, which feeds into not just security concerns about health, but national security concerns as well, particularly with respect to China, in terms of where are we sourcing our chips, where are we getting our high technology products, how do we know that they're not going to interfere with our national security? Is this a good or bad development? That's something we can take up during the Q&A, but to the extent we think rapid growth in the developing world was an important contributor to the reductions in global poverty, we haven't solved that problem yet, and this reversal of globalization may impair our ability to, as a world, to put further dents in poverty, and that's particularly sad for Africa. Now, Africa is trying to push forward itself. They just formed a free trade agreement throughout the continent, but this is a very weak agreement, and it needs to be backed up by other things that will reduce trade costs within the African continent, and it's not clear that this is going to jumpstart Africa the way it needs to be. Well, once we get our act together here on Earth, there's always intergalactic trade, and as you know with Star Wars, the reason why there were Star Wars is there were trade fights between various planets. We're not there yet, but there's always going to be challenges to the process of globalization. There are always going to be trade wars. The question is, can they be contained, and can the benefits of globalization be harnessed for the betterment of all? Thank you very much, and I'd love to entertain any questions you might have.
So, can I get a mic? Hello. Can you hear me? Yes. We have time for questions. We have found in previous years that trying to pass a microphone up and down these rows is very time-consuming and doesn't work very well. So Doug will acknowledge your hand in the air, and please speak loudly. But I'm going to ask Doug to repeat every question so that everybody can hear it.
Okay, we have a first question right here. Great question. What impact might climate change have on globalization? Various factors involved there. So the European Union is moving towards carbon border tax adjustments. In other words, they are going to be introducing carbon taxes, if they don't have them already, and restrictions on domestic emissions of carbon. And they're going to say, well, we can't allow, if we're going to tax our firms this way, and production located in Europe, we cannot allow imports from, say, China or North America with weaker environmental standards from getting access to our market and undermining our own regulations. So Europe is going to be considering taxes at the border to adjust for that. The Biden administration has also talked about a carbon border tax adjustment as well. What's interesting is you usually introduce that after you've introduced a domestic carbon tax, which we haven't done, but the Biden administration wants to go ahead and raise those barriers against polluters around the world. That would be, first of all, it would help the environment to the extent it's providing incentives for carbon abatement and investment in new technology to reduce carbon emissions, but also could reduce global trade, and particularly affect those countries that can't afford, at least immediately, carbon abatement procedures. So I'd say in the short run, that's probably would act to fragment production more across borders and further this deglobalization, but it's something that would be necessary for environmental reasons. But once again, one part of globalization that's been very good here is the spread of technology. particularly solar cells. And there we should be thanking China in some sense for really spending a lot of money domestically to reduce the cost and the price of solar cells that they've been able to export around the world and make much more cheap relative to fossil fuels. So once again, there are various factors going on. I think we have to judge that based on its impact on the environment, not whether globalization has helped or hurt as a result of that. Let's see. Let's go for a student here, and then we'll go for someone else. Sorry.
Good evening, Professor. Earlier you talked about how globalization is decreasing poverty, but the pandemic, among other factors, is kind of slowing down globalization. Do you ever think that globalization alone could reduce greatly or even eliminate extreme poverty in the world?
Well, certainly we're on track in terms of many countries. Oh, sorry. The question is, with the pandemic slowing down sort of the pace of globalization, what are the prospects for reducing global poverty further? Once again, I think so much hinges on Africa. And once again, this is sort of the least globalized part of the world. How many of you have bought a product made in Korea recently? Okay, you may not know it, but you probably did. How many of you bought anything made in China? Okay, how many of you bought anything made in South Africa or Nigeria or Ghana? So this is the region of the world. So once again, if you look at where poverty is, yes, India still has some progress to make, but Africa is really, the big place in the world where much more progress has to be made. Yes, sir.
You mentioned at the start that one of the factors of globalization is labor mobility, which you can talk about it, but I'd like to talk about that more and compare it to immigration problems in Europe and the U.S., but also the idea of the brain drain. One of the things that's happened to Africa, I know, is that a lot of those people have come to the States and it's not even stayed here.
Yeah, so obviously immigration is even, sorry. So the question is about labor mobility across countries as being one facet of globalization they didn't talk about. And what are some of the prospects there? As you sort of hinted in your question, that's probably the most sensitive area, politically sensitive area of all the facets of globalization. We don't think so much about technology going across borders, although there's concerns about China stealing intellectual property. Trade in goods is something that's been going on for a long time, but it's very politically sensitive for countries with regard to international mobility. We see that in the U.S., obviously. We see that in Western Europe with the migrants from the Middle East. And so, the prospect that there's going to be a lot of international mobility of labor seems fairly dim. That said, it can be, for those who move, it's a tremendous economic boon. So you should look at Michael Clemens' work at the Center for Global Development in Washington, a think tank who's written extensively on this. But your question specifically was about, the brain drain, yes. So here's, which is an absolutely real issue, but when countries undertake reforms that allow people to use their talents, we find that they want to go home. So many young Chinese citizens will get educations in the West, and then if they are welcomed back and have an opportunity to use those skills, they will want to go back. The same thing with India. India used to be, if you left India, you stayed away. But I see this talking to Dartmouth students. Since the reforms there and the explosion of economic opportunities, or at least the increase in economic opportunities, there's an opportunity to start a business, to work for a software company in Bangalore, to even work in manufacturing or start a manufacturing firm. So the brain drain is most problematic for those countries that have not, in some sense, opened to commerce and provided a welcoming business environment. Then you want to go and you want to stay away. And the big question is, does a brain drain itself lead or contribute to economic reform that allows those possibilities to be realized? I'd say I don't have a good answer on that. Yes?
Historically, trade has kind of followed or
Right. So the question is about the fact that much of manufacturing will move from country to country based on lower wage costs. And what happens when we introduced advanced technology here in the United States, a high-wage country, that can overcome that low-cost advantage and just produce things here. So if we look at athletic shoes, for example, in my youth, they came from maybe Japan or Korea. And then in my children's lifetime, it came from China. And now that comes from Vietnam and other countries as well. In other words, Nike has sort of moved where it's sourcing based on where the interaction between wages and productivity work best for providing a low-cost product. And of course, when they leave those countries, they're leaving because the wages have gone up and the costs have risen, and then they contribute to the raising of wages in the countries they move into. It's not really a race to the bottom in what was commonly thought. There's a fear among some that that means manufacturing won't make it to Africa. Because I know that Nike is developing technology. First of all, shoes are very labor intensive because it's very intricate. It's hard to, you're not just stamping out a product. But Nike's been working, maybe with artificial intelligence, on machines that will make shoes and just bypass labor altogether. They haven't perfected that yet. But that does raise issues of, can manufacturing ever make it to Africa, which would be the next low-wage region of the world to be used by global companies. Ethiopia has done very well recently with textiles, and they've managed to get clusters of producing textiles and even outcompeting some of the East Asian, South Asian countries. That's a little bit of hope. But I think it's almost product by product. It could be that low-wage manufacturing is not the way that Africa is going to make inroads in the 21st century. It may have to be more agriculture or services. Those would be the other two sectors. And so the path it may not be as easy to follow in the path of what some other developing countries have been able to do. So I don't have it's really tough to say how that's going to play out.
Can you speak about the 301 tariffs with China, the pros and cons, and the future of it?
Sure. So the question is the pros and cons of the Section 301 tariffs on China that President Trump implemented, and President Biden has also now, in press reports, is exploring new tariffs on China. First of all, what does that Section 301 refer to? It's just the provision under U.S. trade law that allows the president to impose retaliatory tariffs against another country for unfair trade practices. So under the Constitution and U.S. trade law, the president just can't do whatever he or she wants with respect to U.S. tariffs. There has to be some legal procedure and justification for those tariffs. So that is why when President Trump came into office and he wanted to hit back at China for all the things that they'd been supposedly doing to the U.S., he couldn't do it immediately. They had to do a Section 301 investigation in the U.S. Trade Representative's office. Once that report had been completed, the tariffs were imposed. And that report, which you can download from the U.S. Trade Representative's office website, talks about forced technology transfer, stealing intellectual property, and a host of other unfair practices that China is alleged to have engaged in, and probably almost certainly has. So the pros and the cons. So the pros would be you might reshore some U.S. manufacturing. You might provide some redress to American firms that have been harmed as a result of that foreign competition. You might get China to change its policies. And you certainly have put other countries on notice that if they engage in similar practices, that they will be punished. Just in terms of assessing those, I would say there's almost no evidence of reshoring of manufacturing from China. And once again, the wage disparity is just so large, what has happened is this has been a tremendous benefit for Vietnam. And so U.S. companies and others are sourcing now from Vietnam and maybe Cambodia and others rather than and moving production from China to avoid those tariffs. It certainly has punished China, possibly given them some reasons for rethinking their policy. Unfortunately, I think President Xi is so committed to a very different path and more of a state-led economic path that I don't think they're going to really change the direction of their policies or change the way they're going. It is also something else I was going to say. But I guess the point would be is that the cost of those tariffs, let me say, the other thing that China did is retaliate against the U.S. So U.S. soybean growers, all of a sudden were locked out of the Chinese market. And other manufacturers found it more difficult to sell in China. So Boeing, they're competing against Airbus. China says, well, we're having this trade war with the U.S. We're going to buy Airbus instead of Boeing aircraft. So that can come back to hurt the U.S. In terms of the actual cost of the tariffs, the evidence is that those costs are passed on to U.S. consumers. So China's not cutting its prices. They're not absorbing some of those tariffs. They're passing them on, so we pay, as consumers, a higher price for those goods from China. But I think the economics can be a little bit narrowing. I think what's more pronounced is the fact that this is a major change in the direction of the U.S.-China relationship, that the Biden administration is not changing many policies that the Trump administration had introduced vis-a-vis China. And so we are on this path where the two countries are going to separate. And they're going to separate mainly for ideological reasons about what we think are standards for market economies and how China doesn't uphold those, and then for foreign policy, strategic reasons, and national security reasons as well, which is why we've banned Huawei from U.S. high-tech markets. So I think the two economies are just diverging. And once again, that's just in terms of the theme of what I was talking about, this period from 1985, 1990 up to 2008, that's when we sort of got along with China. That's when China was moving in a more market-oriented direction. And since the financial crisis and President Xi took over in 2011, I think, we're on divergent paths. So whenever you have the two of the world's largest economies saying we want to be closer together, that's why you see this surge in globalization. Now as we see they're saying, oh, we don't want to be so together, that's why we're in this sort of deglobalization moment. Yes, and then here, sorry, you're next.
You talked about how the African free trade agreement there is weak and needs support from outside countries. Where do you see that support coming from, and do you see any excess advantages to those countries compared to ones who don't support it?
So the question is about the Africa Free Trade Agreement and what is needed to make it sort of not the weak agreement I suggested it was. And what sort of support should they be provided with, and how can that evolve, if that's an accurate representation of your question. There's really not much. First, here's why it's a weak agreement. First of all, the commitments to change domestic policy, we have to see whether they're really going to follow through. So are they going to reduce tariffs on each other's goods the way they say? But even beyond that, infrastructure is so poor in so many African countries that even with tariff reductions, you may not lead to a lot more integration among the African countries. They may have complementary economies, and the links between them may not foster a lot of intra-African trade. But I think the bigger problem is that you can sign these agreements and have these summits, but there has to be, but even if you didn't sign that, there has to be a domestic commitment by politicians and society more broadly that we want to embark on sort of this economic path of having the state have less say in the economy and markets more say. And there are no, sometimes Uganda sort of moved down that path and then sort of begins to deviate from it. Rwanda, Ethiopia, there's been no one country that has acted like some other countries around the world in terms of embracing globalization. So I don't think there's much the rest of the world can do. I don't think the agreement will achieve all that much. Maybe it's a step a little bit in the right direction, but I think what really needs to be done is individual countries have to decide for themselves, the way Deng Xiaoping in China decided then, or the reformers in India in 1991 decided, that we need to move the economy in a different direction, regardless of what others are doing, and see how that works out. They haven't done that yet. There's a question over here. Yes, please.
So I was wondering, Professor, if you could talk a bit about how trade creates these losers and winners. And usually when we think about it, we tend to think in terms of borders, which is a human construct. So one way I would think about trade is that you're creating these winners and losers at the expense of an industry, but not so much country. So can we talk a bit about that and perhaps put it in context of how the trade war that
Absolutely. So great question. So the question is, how do we think about winners and losers in international trade and trade policies? And that's almost something you learn in international trade economics, that it's not every action has an equal and opposite reaction, but that every action you take, there's going to be winners and losers. Although I will qualify that as well. So you're absolutely right. We impose tariffs on China. We might help some domestic firms that are competing against imports from China. But we're also going to hurt exporters that are going to get hit by the retaliation that China will do in response. So once again, you're not helping out those exporters, certainly. And I sort of suggested, too, in response to an earlier question, you may not be even helping the import competing industry because you're just reshifting imports from China to Vietnam. So it's almost too late to help out some of the industries that have been hurt. When we get to other countries around the world, once again, the concern in so many developing countries is, we can't compete in manufacturing. So if we open up to trade, we're going to lose a lot of jobs. A lot of industries are going to go under, and what are we going to win from it? And I think India is a great example of that. First of all, the way India approached it, in fact, most of these countries, and I mentioned this in the context of Korea, many countries, when they're embarking on this process, the reason why they're not exporting a lot is their exchange rate is out of whack with market reality. So you have to devalue. The first thing Manmohan Singh did in India is devalue the exchange rate. Immediately, that makes exporters more price competitive and can lead to greater investment in those export industries and can lead to more employment in those export industries. Second of all, what Manmohan Singh and his team did is they got rid of these quantitative restrictions on imports of capital goods. Now, that may hurt some capital goods producers in India, but it allows you access to the world's best and cheapest capital goods that, once again, is part of investment that will help you export more. And so that is, you want to increase the country's capital stock. You want to increase investment. And you cannot have a competitive, world-class competitive manufacturing industry unless you have the very best equipment operating with the labor that you have. The last thing they did was reduce tariffs and quantitative restrictions on consumer goods, because that's where imports would come in more directly, would adversely affect domestic firms, and lead to some downsizing and some loss of industrial jobs. But through the devaluation and through the reduction in the capital goods barriers, they had already shifted from an economy growing at 4, 5, 6% to an economy growing 7, 8, 9%. And that growth is creating a lot of jobs. And then one of India's great exports is services. And that helped as well. So there's no doubt that when an economy opens up, there are costs and there's harm to certain groups because there's going to be a reshuffling of resources, because there are inefficient industries that are going to be adversely affected. But unfortunately, the reality, I think, is that those are precisely the industries that are holding the economy back. If the idea is to industrialize, India succeeded a long time ago. They had a lot of industry, but it was such low productivity that was holding the whole economy back. And yes, there's a restructuring process, but it makes that industry more efficient, competitive, and more able to hire more people than it was before. And so by moving on to that higher growth path, that's sort of, if you deny yourself that opportunity because you think that there are going to be either losers or there are going to be no winners, well, yes, there are going to be winners too. And if you're bringing people out of poverty, that's a pretty important objective. Let me put it this way too. Every case that I just went over a few cases, there are many of them. Korea, that devaluation, I've done some research showing is basically the U.S. pushing them to devalue. They didn't want to do it. They thought it's going to mess up our economy. And it turns out that was one of the triggers for unleashing a higher growth phase. So everyone wants progress, no one wants change. So unfortunately, you do need change to bring about progress. How about some other questions? Yes, sorry.
Okay, so I have a question. What's your take on the virtual globalization? So for example, I cannot work for any other country except for US, but not only in terms of labor, but also in terms of transporting goods and services. So what's your take on that? Do you think that it has any contribution to the globalization or will be in the future?
So this is a virtual globalization? Mm-hmm. Yep, so people can work anywhere and...
Yes,
okay.
not only in terms of
Right. So the question is about virtual globalization, where we can work just about anywhere and not just provide services for one another, but also transporting goods between markets. So I'll just make 2 points on that. One is that that's a dimension of globalization that we may see more of in coming decades, because once again, I focused mainly on the physical cost of shipping goods between markets, whether by air or by sea, and then the trade barriers that either inhibit that or encourage it. But what is the U.S. economy? Agriculture is 2-3% or so. Lewis Johnson has the latest figures. Manufacturing is about 10%. We are largely a service economy. India is a great service economy. China has a huge service economy. And then the question is, what are the barriers to trading services among countries? And there, it's not as easy as transportation cost changes or taxes, tariff changes, because every service sector has its own rules and regulations. And so whether it's financial services or insurance services or educational services or construction services, every sector is a little bit different. So getting countries on the same page to reduce those barriers is very, very difficult. The way it tends to happen is with multinational investment. That's how you make the service sector more competitive, if you will. So that's saying international investment is important. Virtual services, that would be more through the internet or some of the other regulatory barriers that could be an inhibitor. I guess the second point I make is that artificial intelligence is really changing a lot of different markets, and that's even beyond virtual services. So I haven't said anything about that because I don't really know how that's going to play out, but that could have major repercussions for a lot of different sectors in the economy. I'm sorry, yes?
Dr. Irwin, globalization has reduced global poverty dramatically, but it has also increased intra-country inequality pretty rapidly, especially in China, India, and the United States, of course. And again, part of that probably explains why in your stage 5 you have globalization kind of slowing down. So my question would be, is globalization alone enough to kind of take, because a huge sections of the world economy seems to have lost faith, maybe because of the losers from globalization in countries. So what would be your take on that?
I'm not sure. There's been some loss of faith, but it's mainly, I think, a rise of economic the question is, with the winners and losers, isn't there not sort of a backlash against globalization and the inequality? Inequality has gone up. I'm reminded, because we've talked about India so much, a lot of India, which reformed about 10 years after China. A lot of Indian reformers went to China and asked, how do you do this, and aren't you worried about inequality? And the Chinese reformers, this is very early on, in the late 80s, said, well, our problem is we have too much equality. We're desperately poor. So they were willing to tolerate a lot more inequality to get economic growth up and getting people out of poverty. Now what we see under President Xi is that he's cracking down on the billionaires in China. Once again, I think that's largely for political reasons, but it also might be that inequality leads to economic power that they have, and the party doesn't want to tolerate that. Obviously, economists talk about growing the pie. We want a bigger pie. Actually, I come from New Hampshire, where we have a lot of apple orchards, and we don't grow pies. You have to make another pie. So I don't like that analogy, but to take that analogy, you have to worry about the distribution of the pie as well. And you have to make sure that when you're allowing these new opportunities to arise, that it doesn't become crony capitalism or devolve into that people do benefit. So that means, managing globalization well, redistributive policies, and things of that sort. But at the same time, if you say, well, because we're going to have more inequality, perhaps, and that we can't redistribute the pie well, we don't want the pie to grow, that also creates its own danger, because then you maintain the status quo and you don't make any progress against these things. So yes, it's extremely difficult. And I don't have a slide here, but former Secretary of State of the United States, James Baker, once said something along the lines that the solution to every problem leads to new problems. And so once you've overcome some hurdles, that rises, brings up new issues that have to be dealt with. Yes, over here, and I'll try to get some more people over here.
So you talked about recent changes in like the U.S., China, India. What are some in other regions such as South America or Australia?
It's actually getting to sort of backlash. I'm actually teaching a course right now on some of the economies in Latin America. And there, the problem is one aspect of globalization I haven't talked about is finance and international capital flows. And one of the problems in Latin America is that you have these swings in policy. And so so let's take Argentina. So Argentina did pretty well during the 1990s. They were moving on a path that I was sort of describing, but it ended in a financial crisis, largely because they had a fixed exchange rate and they didn't contain their fiscal deficits. And that led to a huge recession and led to a complete discrediting of that entire approach to economic policy. So they swing in the other direction. And then that begins to not work after a while. And so they're booted out of office, and then they swing back in another direction. They've tried fast, slow, moderate, and now they're in a more populist period. And that's true of other Latin American countries too. So when you get these big swings in policy, it tends not to work out very well. And that gets to the management issue. How do you, it's a multidimensional thing. I talked mainly about trade, but getting the financial side or the capital account side, if you're taking international finance, that's critically important to ensuring that you have not just more rapid growth, but stable growth and not encounter crises. Because crises delegitimize the previous model, even if some of those things weren't necessarily the drivers of that. I think I've exhausted your patience, and so I don't see.
One more question.
One more question. I don't see. Oh, sorry. Yes. Yep. No, you're right in the light. Yep.
Thank you for this presentation tonight. It was really wonderful. There's no doubt when we're looking at sub-Saharan Africa, where 3/4 of the population is under the age of 26 years old, and they're still all asking, what am I going to do when I grow up? And trade is an important part of the solution, but I think the more important question is how we do trade. So I'm struck tonight, I think some of what you might label as protectionism, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and our friend Bono would call social protections. That in trade agreements, it's absolutely essential that we have protections for the vulnerable, that we're able to secure not a race to the bottom in wages, but a decent living wage, that we are able to have general labor and climate protections. So as we've looked at, how the trade regime has evolved, in particular with recent negotiations around the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the U.S. is out of, and the new NAFTA, which people know here in Minnesota because we still have communities that are affected by the implementation of NAFTA here in Minnesota in the mid-1990s. So, how do we ensure that we have social protections in trade? The new NAFTA allowed us to essentially stop some of these crazy arbitration mechanisms, which allowed corporations to circumvent local labor, environmental laws, human rights laws. We've seen improvements there also across development and labor. And with the level of instability we had because of the pandemic, I think largely because of a trade regime that left us ill-prepared to deal with this crisis, I think the ultimate question is, where is the balance between wanting to have open cooperative trade that lifts all boats, but is not something that circumvents those critical protections which we know every human being on Earth needs?
Okay, so that's a very difficult question to summarize. I hope most people could hear it, because thankfully you were projecting very well. You started out with Africa, and then we went to sort of trade agreements and the new NAFTA and things of that sort. And I think it is important to keep these separate, because I think when we're talking about Africa, which you're absolutely right, the youth there are looking for what is going to be their economic opportunity? What is their future? Is there a future in Africa, or are they desperate to get out? That's a little baby step, but you could have all the provisions in the world, and I'm not sure that's going to do all that much. I think each country, in many of the cases I talked about in Latin America, South Asia, East Asia, they didn't sign some trade agreement and then start growing rapidly. They didn't sign some trade agreement and then investment blooms and they start reducing poverty. They decided themselves they were going to clean up their act, that they were going to try to reduce corruption, have more transparency. Sometimes it involved a movement towards greater democracy, which is all too absent in Africa. But certainly it could start with the business environment. And if, unless that happens, trade agreements, social protections, it's almost irrelevant. They need to think about what it is, the foundations of creating economic opportunity, what those foundations are. And then, once you sort of have that, then you can talk about international agreements and introducing some of these safeguards or other mechanisms. Now, the U.S.-Mexico relationship, that's already more advanced. So there you're absolutely right that that framework can be updated, that the rules can be improved, and some of the things you were talking about have become very important. But I think for this continent, once again, signing a trade agreement with the U.S., that's not it. That's not where the action is going to be in terms of providing economic opportunity and putting a dent in poverty. So,
Well,
thank you very much.
So we'll have a little reception outside. See your friends there, see our speaker there. Thank you for coming.